What happens when a president tries to bully the world's most powerful central bank? Trump's explosive clash with Fed Chair Jerome Powell isn't just political drama. It's a dangerous play with America's economic future. Why is Trump demanding rate cuts while pushing policies that fuel inflation? The shocking truth behind this power grab threatens every American's wallet. Subscribe to get the latest analysis to make democracy great again. The escalating confrontation between Donald Trump and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell isn't just another political spat. It's a full-scale assault on the foundational principles of American economic stability. How possibly can a man who racked up $7.8 trillion in new debt during his presidency, whose 2017 tax cuts funneled 83% of benefits to the top 1%, and whose trade wars cost U.S. farmers $28 billion in lost exports, presume to lecture the Federal Reserve on monetary policy? The sheer recklessness of Trump's demands for immediate rate cuts, while inflation still hovers at 3.9%, reveals a dangerous blend of ignorance and arrogance, echoing the worst mistakes of past U.S. leaders who prioritize political expediency over economic sanity. This isn't just misguided. It's a recipe for repeating the stagflation nightmares of the 1970s, all while lining the pockets of billionaires like Trump himself. Let's start with the historical playbook Trump is dusting off. In 1972, President Richard Nixon strong-armed Fed Chair Arthur Burns into slashing rates ahead of his re-election campaign, a move famously caught on Oval Office tapes. The result? A decade of the Great Inflation where prices rose 12% annually and unemployment stagnated above 6%. Burns later admitted the Fed had become a hostage to the White House, a cautionary tale Trump seems determined to ignore. Now, Trump is openly threatening to attend Fed meetings and demand rate cuts, despite Powell's clear warnings that political interference risks destabilizing the economy. It's Nixon's playbook on steroids, a blatant power grab disguised as populism. Trump's obsession with rate cuts isn't just wrong-headed, it's self-serving. His $1.3 billion Deutsche Bank loans, $2 billion Saudi Gulf deal, and $1.6 billion Truth Social windfall all thrive on cheap money. By pressuring the Fed to slash rates, Trump isn't fighting for Main Street. He's rigging the system for Mar-a-Lago. This mirrors the 2017 tax cuts, where corporations use savings for stock buybacks rather than wage hikes, exacerbating wealth inequality. The Fed's current 4.25 to 4.5% rate range, while higher than the near-zero levels of the pandemic, remains below historical averages. Yet Trump wants to drag rates back to emergency lows, ignoring warnings from economists that his own policies, 10% tariffs, mass deportations, and $5 trillion in tax cuts would fuel inflation. The numbers don't lie. Trump's proposed tariffs alone would act as a $2,300 annual tax on middle-class families, according to the Peterson Institute, while deporting 11 million workers could shrink GDP by 6%, Moody's Analytics. Combine these with regressive tax cuts, and you get a toxic brew of soaring prices and stagnant wages. The Fed estimates Trump's agenda could add 2.5 percentage points to inflation, pushing it back toward 1970s levels. Yet Trump dismisses these concerns, boasting he has better instinct than those eggheads. The same instincts that led him to suggest injecting bleach for COVID and claim climate change is a Chinese hoax. Powell's refusal to cave to this pressure is a rare bright spot. Appointed by Trump in 2018, Powell initially continued his predecessor, Janet Yellen's rate hikes to prevent overheating. But Trump's Twitter tirades and threats to fire him, including calling Powell worse than Xi Jinping, forced a pivot in 2019, when the Fed abandoned quantitative tightening to appease markets. This flip-flop, driven by political bullying, contributed to the asset bubbles that later burst during the pandemic. Now, with inflation still above the Fed's 2% target, Powell is wisely holding firm, recognizing that premature cuts could reignite price surges while delaying them risks recession. It's a balancing act Trump's bombast makes infinitely harder. The human cost of Trump's meddling is staggering. When Nixon pressured Burns, families faced double-digit inflation that erased savings and spiked mortgage rates. Today, Trump's policies threaten similar pain: 34% higher food prices and 28% higher construction costs from labor shortages, per the Economic Policy Institute. For working-class Americans already squeezed by cumulative 22% inflation since 2020, this isn't abstract. It's choosing between rent and prescriptions. Yet Trump's solution, slashing rates, would only deepen the crisis, as cheap money fuels speculative bubbles rather than productive investment. The Fed's independence, enshrined since 1913, exists precisely to prevent this scenario. By insulating monetary policy from electoral cycles, the Fed can make tough decisions, like Volcker's 20% rates in the 80s, that politicians avoid. Trump's threat to have a say in Fed policy undermines this firewall, inviting short-term political calculations to override long-term stability. His allies have even drafted plans to repeal the Fed's dual mandate, effectively turning it into a political tool. The consequences would be catastrophic. Markets would punish the dollar, borrowing costs would skyrocket, and the Fed's credibility, painstakingly rebuilt since the Volcker era, would evaporate. Trump's track record proves he'll sacrifice stability for self-interest. His 2017 tax cuts blew a $2 trillion hole in revenues, requiring the Fed to prop up markets with emergency measures. His trade wars necessitated $28 billion in farm bailouts, and his COVID response ballooned the Fed's balance sheet to $8.9 trillion. Now, he wants to reprise this chaos, pushing policies that would force the Fed to monetize debt, a direct path to hyperinflation. Powell's measured stance isn't timidity. It's the only rational response to a leader who treats the economy like a reality TV show. The stakes couldn't be higher. The Fed's independence isn't some bureaucratic technicality, it's the bedrock of the dollar's global reserve status. When Nixon weakened the Fed, it took 15 years and multiple recessions to restore credibility. Trump's assault risks permanent damage, emboldening future politicians to hijack monetary policy for partisan gains. The result? A fractured economy where boom-bust cycles become the norm and working Americans pay the price. In the end, this clash isn't about Powell. It's about whether the U.S. learns from history or repeats its worst mistakes. Trump's demands aren't just reckless. They're a billionaire's gambit to exploit the Fed for personal gain. The 70s taught us that political meddling in monetary policy leads to disaster. The question now is whether we'll heed that lesson or let Trump's ego write the next chapter of economic decline. Subscribe to get the latest analysis to make democracy great again.